Good morning and welcome to the Symposium's second session, Spain's Initial Support to the American Revolution, where we will explore the role of private merchants and the role of diplomacy during the early stages of the revolution. There will be a Q&A period following those two presentations. There will be a coffee break at a little past 11:30, and we will reconvene at noon sharp to listen to the keynote address by Professor Richard Kagan. We will open today with Mrs. Bela Valldecabres, Chairwoman and CEO of Spain's Royal Mint since 2021. Mrs. Valldecabres holds a PhD in law from the University Carlos III de Madrid and has worked as a criminal judge, criminal law lecturer at several Spanish universities and served as Chief of Staff for the Vice President of the Government of Spain and senior consultant for several ministerial departments. She also serves as a board member in several public companies and is a member of the board of directors of the Mint Directors Association. Please join me in welcoming Mrs. Valldecabres.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Allow me to begin by thank you for the opportunity of being here today on this incredible stage and to express our deep satisfaction that once again Spanish coinage fulfills one of its more noble functions, to serve as a physical medium for the dissemination of a message rooted in history and culture. I strongly believe in collaboration between institutions, and there's no better example than this symposium, so well organized by the Queen Sofia Spanish Institute, managed by Begoña Santos, and the National Society Daughters of the American Revolution, led by Jeannie Sebastian Storage as a President General. So irresistible that we wanted to be part of it today in any way we could. It is a true honor. Allow me to begin by thanking you the opportunity of being here today on this incredible stage. It is a true honor to me. This is a very special occasion in which we celebrate not only a commemorative incident, but also a moment of historical reflection that connects cultures, nations, and generations. The 250th anniversary of the independence of the United States acquires a symbolic value that transcends borders. Let me go next. Okay.
In 1776, the 13 colonies raised their voices in the pursuit of independence. And in that historic struggle, Spain played a decisive role. Figures such as King Charles III, George Washington, Bernardo de Galvez, and Admiral Luis de Cordova, among others, together with Spain's financial and logistical support, made possible what once seemed impossible. Those shipments of silver, the famous Spanish dollars or pieces of 8, gave birth to the very first American dollar. Today, the Royal Mint of Spain pays tribute to that achievement with a unique collection created to commemorate the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence of the United States of America. Very soon you will discover this series that bridges past and present in every coin.
Okay, I'm sorry. Let me introduce you briefly what is the Royal Spanish Mint. Since its foundation in Madrid by Royal Chapter of King Philip III on February 18th, 1614, the Mint has evolved from a workshop supplying coinage to the court into a modern industrial factory responsible for the production of all Spanish currency. During the 18th century, it became the governing center for all means of the empire, the Americas, both in the Iberian Peninsula and in the Americas. I would like to point that since 1535, the Spanish Empire had the first global company. The mints established from Mexico to Chile, from Peru to Colombia, Bolivia, or Dominican Republic. The engraving of dies was centralized. Minting was mechanized. The school of engraving was created, and the quality of production across all mints was supervised. Thanks to this policy, Spanish coinage reached exceptional quality, with the bust pieces of Charles III standing out as international currency and symbols of trust in global trade. The connection between the Spanish mint and the American history does not end there. In 1778, by order of King Charles III, and at the proposal of Governor General Bernardo de Galvez, large merit medals were minted for Native American chiefs allied with Spain in Louisiana as a gesture of recognition and respect, as the Professor Gonzalo Quintero remembered yesterday. These medals, produced in Madrid, were explicitly mentioned in peace treaties with indigenous nations, and many of them were buried alongside the recipients as symbols of honors. This is the original mint of Madrid, which is right now in Madrid. Not anymore, the building has changed their place. And in 1893, we both joined the Royal Spanish Mint and the Royal Stamp. And now we are Fábrica Nacional de Moneda y Timbre, Real Casa de la Moneda, also known as Money Heist Casa de Papel. We produce legal tenders, banknotes, security documents, digital certificates, and high-value added products. I would like that the connection between the Spanish Mint and the American history does not end there. As you might see in the display outside, we have published and written the foreword of a book titled We the Hispanics, which transports us to this crucial and often overlooked moment in the shared history of Spain and the United States of America. The Spanish crown, the reign of Charles III, played a vital role in the struggle for the independence of the 13 colonies. Financial and military support represented not only a turning point in the conflict, but a decisive contribution to the birth of a free, sovereign nation. That's why we struck 10 coins. 3 of them are 8 reales, of which we preview only 3 in October 2025, and which remind us of the importance of such figures as Charles III, whom we depict alongside with George Washington. The second silver coin depicts a forgotten hero, Jordi Farragut, a Spanish representative of the more of those hundreds of thousands of Hispanics from all over the vast Spanish territories in those years, who contributed in a decisive way to the outcome of the conflict, participating in case of Jordi Farragut both in the army and in the Navy, and whose son would become a national hero, David Farragut, remembered by history as the US Navy's first admiral. The third coin shows the Spanish $1,000 dollar, also known as piece of 8, pieza de ocho, real de a ocho, which was the US monetary standard used to finance the conflict against the English, and on which the first US $1,000 dollar was struck. And the first American dollar, called Flowing Hair Dollar, struck in Philadelphia Mint in 1796. The rest of the series will be released in 2026. Do more than tell a story. there's no need to present Bernardo de Galvez and his participation at Baton Rouge, Mobile, and Pensacola, ensuring the control over the Gulf of Mexico. Luis de Cordova, who commanded the Spanish fleet that paralyzed British trade, inflicting the greatest blow ever suffered by the Royal Navy. He was the commander of the famous Santísima Trinidad. Admiral Solano Ibote escorted a convoy of more than 100 ships and 12,500 soldiers to reinforce the troops at the front. Royal Commissioner Francisco de Saavedra y Sangronis obtained the necessary funding for the military operations at Yorktown in record time, the final blow to the British. And there's one coin we wanted to mint not only in silver, but also in gold, dedicated to Isabella of Castile, the queen who sponsored Christopher Columbus and the first real woman to be depicted in a US coin. The reverse of the silver coin shows face-to-face to George Washington and Charles III, friends who never met. This collection are an invitation to look back with rigor and learn from the past, because important enterprises like this were built on the greatness of shared values: liberty, justice, and equality. From the Royal Mint, we are honored to support initiatives like this, and I can only thank you for your attention. We'll be delighted to provide you with more information at our booth outside. Thank you very much. Visit our museum. Thank you.
Our next speaker, Dr. Elisa Vargas, will explore the role of private merchants, Gardoki and Sons and others. Dr. Vargas is a multidisciplinary scholar who holds a PhD and an advanced studies diploma in Spanish American history from the Universidad Complutense de Madrid, based on her investigation, Territory, Landscape, and the Construction of a New Republic. She holds a master's degree in international affairs from Columbia University and a BA in anthropology from the Universidad de los Andes in Bogotá, Colombia. Dr. Vargas was a fellow of the Fred W. Smith Library in Mount Vernon and a fellow of the Preventive Diplomacy and Conflict Resolution Program of the Department of State in Washington, D.C., after serving as advisor for the President of Colombia. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Vargas.
Good morning. And thank you very much for being here today on a Saturday morning. I guess that many people put off their plans to come and listen to us. So that's very, very nice. Thank you to the Queen Sofia Spanish Institute, the Ramon Areces Foundation, and the Daughters of the American Revolution for making this possible today. I am going to touch a little bit before talking about Cardoqui and Sons Company on some commercial topics which are not very interesting, but are absolutely important to our topic today. And these are going to be the Navigation Acts of 1650s and 1660s. And don't worry, we're going a little bit back in time, but it's really important to understand what we're going to talk today. These ordained that all colonial imports were to be shipped through English vessels and had to pass through English ports in order to be sold in Europe. The rule, however, was often contested, as Dr. Gabriel Paquet said yesterday. Some traded fish and surplus through British merchants in English vessels, but directly with the Iberian Peninsula, ignoring the mandatory stops in English ports. As a result, in 1663, King Charles II endorsed New England's plea to export fish and timber to the Iberian Peninsula directly. The enactment of the Navigation Act of 1663 also stated that salt and wine could be traded and returned. In reality, it recognized a long-standing tradition between both regions. Newfoundland fisheries required tons of salt to cure their fish. Thus, salt trade with Spain began as early as the 16th century, and the resulting sun-dried codfish would be traded back for salt and wine from Spain and Portugal. American cod fisheries would receive special privileges and equal standing with domestic fisheries, and in time, governmental encouragement to prosper commercially in south of Europe. So much that codfish, or how we know it in Spanish, bacalao, became one of the main staple foods in Portuguese and Spanish cuisine, notwithstanding that it is alien to Iberian waters. This seemingly insignificant loophole in trade legislation opened the way to other specialty staples, as sugar. According to James G. Leyden, these allowed the accretion of credits in Iberia for transferal to England to aid colonials in overcoming their adverse balance of payments. We just heard Dr. Bela talk about the mintage, which is really important to understand this part. It was no secret that American colonists who bought English goods required sources of specie to avoid choking limitations on their growth. In other words, the colonial compact allowed for traders to acquire sources of wealth or mintage to pay for their English creditors. Thus, in time, regulations would encourage the importation of foreign mintage. These benefits, however, were not perceived equally in Spain. As a matter of fact, they posed a threat to peninsular commerce, especially under the Anglo-Spanish Treaty of 1667 or the Treaty of Madrid, which was so well explained yesterday, where England received the most advantageous concessions in European Spain, guaranteeing their merchants extraterritorial status, which froze Spanish duties on English imports in accordance to the monetary levels of the reign of King Charles II. That was between 1665 and 1770. That is, they were not going to pay much tax at all. Additionally, some terms for the trade aimed at limiting contraband or smuggling, and these were relinquished with the treaty. After the War of the Spanish Succession, a number of disputes clouded Anglo-Spanish relations. These were motivated mainly by Britain's eagerness to expand their South Sea Company, founded in 1711, and Spain's frustration over the Treaty of Madrid. Okay, there we go. And I want you to see the company, the coat of arms of the company was Agaribus usque auroram, which means from Cadiz to dawn. And it's important because it was a British company. Under the new Bourbon law rule, all concessions came into review. Therefore, English importers had to start paying the same duties as Spaniards. Customs inspectors opened boxes in the presence of merchants, and actions to limit contraband were ferociously enforced. Then again, the Treaty of Utrecht that ended the Spanish War of Succession, the Treaty of Madrid was reinforced, and most of its terms were ratified. Hold on, it's only just 4 seconds more until we get over the boring part, but it's important to understand why this was so important. Spain granted the South Sea Company the rights to supply African slaves in 1713, as Professor Gay Paquette said yesterday. That was called the Asiento de Negros. And this was terrible because lots of contraband and smuggling came into the ships, into not only Spanish America, and it would also generate speculation and corruption. It would bankrupt a number of investors and obviously boost contraband. Slave ships would not only have slaves, but all kinds of things. And this, as expected, gave way into the Jenkins-era War, or Guerra del Asiento. Again, Professor Paquette explained it yesterday pretty well, so I'm not going to go through that painful description of the war. So although the Treaty of Madrid was reinforced after Utrecht, the reality proved different. Spain would begin to enact a number of mercantilist reforms aimed at diminishing British commercial dominance in the Americas, particularly after the family alliance with the Bourbon family and France. The new reforms raised up the already existing tensions between merchants, local authorities, and royal officials. With the 7 Years' War of 1758 between France and Britain, in which Spain later joined in 1761, tensions reached a new ceiling. Spain favored the French, British permits were delayed or detained, invoices examined, goods stores. Well, we've all traveled. We know exactly what happens in customs, how they open the bag. So imagine this with all the ships back then. Some English ships fell price to Spanish authorities. Others were said to be victims of renewed harassment and even bullied into never returning back to Spain. But guess who? Those who did make it, however, came from the colonies, bringing codfish through 3 major ports, which were Bilbao, Barcelona, and Cádiz. I want you to remember that is Bilbao. And that little circle over there is where our main person of the day, which is going to be Gardoqui, lived. So just have that in mind. In conclusion, at the end of this era, British policies towards Madrid strove to continually renew the treaties that favored the British, draining off mintage and coins from Spain. Bullion was specifically shielded by the treaties negotiated and enacted by both parties. However, the truth of the matter was that organized bullion smuggling, organized corruption, bled both of them dry. One Spanish minister, Grimaldi, complained constantly of English warships entering their harbors to commit contraband as they were not subject to inspections. In his own words, they had carried large sums of money. As a result, export licenses were not renewed, mail packets vessels were checked. These were supposed to be exempt from inspectors, but yet they inspected them. And by the mid-1800s, havoc was all over the Spanish ports, and British were not happy. The Iberian authorities began to check on these vessels routinely. Spanish merchants became more active in distributing goods from England and abroad. The fracas of the Anglo-Spanish commercial negotiations in the 18th century had but a handful of victors. These were the codfish merchants. Much of them were from the colonies here, which continued to arrive to Bilbao from Newfoundland and New England despite the constant disputes. Bilbao lacked an English consul, thus the commerce of this product fell directly into local hands. According again to James G. Lydon, while 220 American ships reached the Nervión River port in Bilbao in the 1770s, only 190 reached Barcelona and 114 Cádiz. Most of them were carrying codfish. So that's the boring part. Now we're going to talk about the fun part, which is codfish. And it's probably why I wanted to put codfish very close to merchants. Codfish was a key product for Spain. For one, it could supply the shortages of salted fish within its economy, offering a product that was cheap, easy to conserve, and ideal for Catholic festivities that ordained abstinence for certain foods, such as red meats. On the other hand, during the ancient regime, not many could afford proteins other than salted fish or the occasional poultry. There you go, sorry. Since the times of the Vikings, codfish was valuable. It was a great commodity. It was popular, easy to trade, to store, and most importantly, it was cheap. According to Fernand Braudel, salted codfish was a food per pounds. It was also called poor John in England when it was kept in poor conditions. known familiarly to some as blocky, and sometimes confused with other relatives such as mulval, green cod, greenfish, or hake. Sometimes so berated that in slang, cod is synonymous to hoax, to trick, or to fool someone. In the Iberian world, however, codfish achieved fair prominence, referred to as bacallá, bacayú, or bacalao, and the smaller types known as abadejo, maruca, egletina, or bacaladilla appear in more than 1,000 traditional recipes in Portuguese, Spanish, and Latin American cuisine. According to Jerónimo Ustariz, a Spanish 18th century economist, an average Catholic Castilian family of 4 would consume around 6 million ounces of codfish annually. That is around 171 kilograms. There you go. And this shows how they actually produce the fish in the ships. Well, and the key aspect of codfish is that they actually could make 3 trips a year, if weather conditions were good, to bring back and forth codfish. It was perfect for the business. And I'm hoping that you, or some of you, remember these. I sure do, with dread, actually. So, cod liver oil was good for babies, for children, as we know. It was good for it was even good for women and all the animals in the farm. I could not find, however, anything referring to men. So you men were lucky. So that is why maybe it took a peasant's family to understand the value of bacalao. And now we're going to talk about the gardoquis. The first registered gardoqui appears in the township of La Rabesúa, Vizcaya, around the 17th century. The first to engage in commercial activities was Tomas de Gardoqui y Alayo, son of Domingo and Ana, who were probably wool traders or wool farmers, we don't know. He married Teresa Meseda from Lumo, and most importantly, from a wealthier family. They had some money to go to Bilbao. The couple would have 3 sons and would eventually move and start up a number of commercial activities. Of the 3 sons, José Ignacio, the youngest, would begin to run at the age of 31 what would become the Gardoqui Trade Company, and this is why it's so important now. He married in 1726 to a wealthy heiress and member of one of the ruling families of Bilbao, María Simona de Arriquíbar y Mescorta. I could not find a picture of her, unfortunately. But she was a member of the Arriquíbar clan, one of the very few families who founded the first consulate in Bilbao back in 1718. According to the registry of the Consulado and the Casa de Contratación de Bilbao, members of the Arriquíbar and the Gardoqui clan were elected regularly as either priors or consuls from the mid-1730s onwards. Let's have into account that the port of Bilbao had been recently opened in the 18th century, and they started working around 1750. So from the very beginning, these people were managing the consulate. And the consulate is not, as we know now, the typical to take the passports. It was basically the office of the traders and merchants who did treaties with other ports and agreements to import and export fish or wool or whatever it was. In this case, it was also iron and mintage. These appointments will allow the families to broaden commercial ties elsewhere while tightening the grip over the local trade business. Merely 3 decades after, on the 4th of October 1756, José would register the Gardoqui and Son Company, together with his eldest son, José Joaquín. 2 years later, in 1758, he would change the company's name to Gardoqui and Sons, after another one of his sons, Diego, which is going to be our Diego from now on, joined the trade. So that's Diego. That's our Diego. And that's the very fancy suit that he had, and it's in Madrid. Diego was born on a foggy 12th of November, 1735. He was groomed to be a banker. He was soon sent to London to learn the trade of commercial trade, receiving constant supervision by his uncle Nicolás de Arriquíbar. He was also a notable economist and lawyer. Diego was to become one of the very few Spaniards fluent in English, and that's going to be key. An attribute that will become handy for the government. So much so as a patriarch of the family passed away, leaving Doña Maria Simona in charge of one of the largest codfish trading companies in the port. Back then, the Basque Country had women and men were able to inherit and to have property equally. So it's not something so strange. True to the fathers, that the woman ended up leading the company. True to the father's wishes, Diego's brothers and mother continued to support his career by acquiring a post in the Bilbao consulate. They introduced him into highly coveted positions in the Bilbao City Council, and they launched his professional career in the public sector, especially sending him off to Madrid. So in less than a decade, Diego was appointed as an advisor to the courts in Madrid and was suddenly called to channel secret aid to the 13 colonies in America through his family's business. Now, let's go to our story. There you go. Okay, there. It starts with Arthur Lee. We've heard about him since yesterday. He was a delegate to the United States Congress who requested to meet with the Marquis of Grimaldi, former Secretary of State of Foreign Affairs of King Carlos III of Spain. Lee was part of the American delegation in charge of obtaining financial and logistical support for the cause, as we heard. Lee was on his way to Madrid, while Grimaldi was on his way to take charge of the Spanish embassy in Rome. There's all kinds of versions about this meeting, but what one can think is that Grimaldi was not interested in Lee being seen, especially by the British agents in Madrid. So I can't imagine him hurrying and his horse to meet him in Burgos, where nobody else could actually see him. The date was supposed to be March 1777, and the clandestine venue was somewhere in Burgos, a small town a few hours away from Madrid. It was perfect for the meeting. Apart from Grimaldi, none other than a young advisor accompanied the minister. Although the meeting between Grimaldi and Lee did not result in the expected official Spanish support for the American cause, it did, however, open the doors to significant secret aid to be channeled through none other than the company of Don Diego. Advisor to the crown, and in this very fortunate case, official translator to Grimaldi. Again, speaking English was key. According to Lee's report to the American commissioners in Paris, Spain agreed to send clothes, blankets, and tents from the city of Bilbao, leaving the operation in charge of Diego de Gardoqui, who would personally hire the ships and crew and monitor the shipment of supplies to Havana and the port of New Orleans. Louisiana's governor, which you met yesterday, Bernardo de Galvez, would add ammunition and other supplies to the rebel army's cache. Once in American waters, the rebel ships would be authorized to pick up the cargo in Spanish ports. A secret loan equivalent to, that's what they say, 4 million reales, which was equivalent to $500,000 continental dollars, in medicines, muskets, blue wool cloths, which we will see later on, and white fabrics to make the distinctive uniforms of the Continental Army, buttons, socks, footwear, anchors, ropes, and sails, among other naval artifacts, tents, and blankets were to be sent. So from 1777 onwards, Diego would launch the daring undertaking of channeling the secret Spanish aid to the United States, using his family's business as a cover. Nothing new. As Gardoqui and Sons Company, according to Dr. Quintero, had long been involved in supplying arms and supplies to the American revolutionaries. For example, on February 1775, a year and a half prior to the Declaration of Independence of the United States, and long before the courts of France and Spain used Beaumarchais as a cover for the same purpose, the Basque Company had already sent 300 muskets and bayonets and almost double that number of pairs of pistols for the American revolutionaries. And this quote is really short, it's not that long. And this is a letter from Jose Gardoqui to Jeremiah Lee, Diego de Gardoqui, where he says, "We were determined at all events to assist you accordingly. Remember that Jose was Diego's brother, We found out means to procure as many muskets and pistols as were ready-made on the parts for the king's army. The quantity was small, having only 300 muskets and bayonets, and about double the number of parent pistols ready. Besides which, they must be got with a good deal of caution and ship. As to secrecy, You may depend it is as much our interest as anyone's that the English will look sharp in every port. Some sources say that some of these muskets were hidden in our codfish. That's why it's so interesting. So the trade routes established previously between Bilbao and the American ports of Salem, Newburyport, Beverly, and Boston had introduced, there you go, Gardoqui to a number of prominent American merchants, closely linked to the cost of the revolution, such as the Cabot brothers, which we heard about yesterday, the Elbridge and Samuel Russell Jerry, commissioned by the Second Continental Congress to supply the rebel army. The Gardoqui family knew how to take advantage of this extraordinary opportunity by identifying Spain's interests with their own, something that is so usual nowadays. Using the trade routes, connections, and know-how, the clan increased its capital exponentially. I have found that the starting date for this was 1736, when they acquired their first permit to import codfish to Spain with 3 ships or navíos that carried between 90 to 140 tons each. Although we do not know how much José Gardoqui invested in his first company, as it is not registered in the consulate, or at least I haven't found any registry, we do know that in 1756, Gardoqui and Son was valued in a little bit more than $1 million reales. Later, in 1761, they registered another navío for the previous 3. We also know that after the patriarch's death in 1765, the family inherited 2,600,000 reales, which included the company that was worth 1 million reales, 2 houses, stocks, jewels, and other investments. That means that they were making a very good business by then. However, things really improved after 1765. In 1767, according to the city census, they built a brand new house in the posh city center, the one that I showed you before, with views to the Nervión River in the street that crosses from Santa Maria to Santiago. In other words, a whole block that will earn in 1822 a victor or a municipal recognition for the merits of the Gardoqui family. The house no longer stands, but in its place there's a street named after the last celebrity, Cardinal Gardoqui. According to the will of Maria Simona, the mother, the house is worth 45,000 reales. I know that it's meaningless to us now, talking about these probably Professor Ferreiro is going to be the one who's going to solve all those monetary issues. But that was a lot. It was a deal of money, and it was a nice posh house, according to the descriptions. By 1778, the firm was worth 2,146,000 reales, twice its value than that of 1765. According to the Casa de Contratación de Bilbao, they own 2 more bergantines. Those are big, the San Jose and the San Nicolás. These carried around 150 to 200 tons each, and 3 frigates, even bigger, the San Jose, the San Agustin, and the Atlantic. Those are the ones that are registered in Bilbao. We really don't know how much was registered in London or in the colonies. We never know. I could not find any information about that. By 1791, and according to the Averías or Customs House, the annual revenues of Gardoqui and Sons would exceed 600,000 reales annually. And there are those who claim that they had earned an estimated capital of 10 million reales. That is in about a decade. It is hard to believe that the Gardoqui's achievements have little to do with their North American incursion, especially when the rest of their fellow tradesmen who were not trading with the 13 colonies were broke. Now back to our topic. In the first years of the American War, the role of Gardoqui family would be essential to keep the Continental Army supplied. When the British Navy closed the American ports on the East Coast, the Spanish aid to the American revolutionaries had to be sent through Cuba and New Orleans, from where American agents would make it reach its destination through the Mississippi River. With the entry of Spain into the war against Great Britain in June 1779, the need for secret agents would disappear. Nonetheless, Don Diego continued trading with his American partners and clients, broadening his list of contacts, or as we would say today, networking. It was possibly one of Don Diego's most remarkable talents. For example, his relationship with John Adams, who, as we know, was not an easy person to be friends with. He was the first vice president and later the second president of the United States. Their first meeting took place by chance in 1780 in the course of Adams' trip to Paris to join the United States. So Adams was not in a very happy mood because his ship was forced to dock at El Ferrol and was broken. So he decided to just walk in the worst weather over to Paris. I don't know what he thought. In the rush to reach his destination and replace Celestine, Adams decided to continue walking in the middle of winter, which is not as bad as here in Washington, but it's bad. According to his personal diary and his correspondence with his wife Abigail, shortly after arriving to Bilbao, he heard a knock on his door, and it was Diego de Gardoqui. He was going to invite him over to his house for a dinner party. From that night on, Gardoqui became his personal guide to Spain and a very close friend. On September 1781, and once the British were defeated at the Battle of Yorktown, the American Congress began to consider entering into negotiations with Spain to discuss two main points: the navigation on the Mississippi River and the definition of the borders south and west of the new nation. And in this case, I am going to remind our listeners about what Dr. Quintero said yesterday about these limits. As Spain had not been a formal ally of the American revolutionaries and was unwilling to recognize the United States as a country, the American negotiators in Paris felt no need to inform the Spanish government about their territorial agreements with the British, which established the parallel on the 31st parallel. When in 1784, the Spanish government decided it needed to send an official envoy to the United States, it was no surprise that they would choose again our Diego Gardoqui. He was selected for such a crucial posting. He knew everyone. He was friends with even the president, the vice president. Spain's position controlling navigation along the Mississippi River was absolutely of the greatest importance. But unfortunately, it contravened the practice of international law at the time. At 49 years of age, Gardoqui presented himself as the ideal candidate to unblock the negotiations of the United States. He not only knew George Washington personally, but also had an extensive network of contacts among the delegates of Congress, where he was known for the role that Gardoqui and Sons had played in delivering secret Spanish aid to the American revolutionaries. Richard Henry Lee, the president of Congress in 1785, Arthur Lee, James Monroe, they demonstrated in favor of the Spanish thesis in exchange for commercial rights. These were keenly aware that the exports of codfish to Spain produced between $4 and $5 million annually, a business that northern states were keen to protect. Gardoqui presented his credentials as plenipotentiary minister of the King of Spain on June 22, 1785. Until the entry into force of the Constitution in 1789, the young American Republic was a confederation in which the central state had very little power, as Dr. Quintero said yesterday. So in the absence of a president or a prime minister during those days, the most prominent figure in the executive office was the Secretary of Foreign Affairs, John Jay. He was in charge of negotiation the treaties with Gardoqui. Jay had been sent to Spain between 1779 and 1782, where, in the words of Stacy Schiff, he spent 30 murderous months on the periphery of the Spanish court. Jay did not speak Spanish. He did not succeed in attaining an alliance between the two nations, nor the Spanish recognition for the independence of the United States. The fact is that John Jay returned from Spain really frustrated. However, despite his personal views, Jay was realistic and knew that the weakness of his young nation needed a long period of peace and a good ally in Europe. Thus, the negotiations between Jay and Gardoqui lasted for almost a year. In August 1786, Jay submitted to the American Congress a principle of agreements in which, although Spain granted certain commercial privileges to North American ships and ports in Spanish America, it denied their access to the Mississippi. Although it obtained 7 votes to 5, it was not approved, as a majority of 9 was required. After many negotiations with the government of Madrid still reluctant to renounce its sovereignty over the Mississippi, Gardoqui proposed to Jay that American merchants could navigate through the river in exchange for a payment. When it seemed that an agreement was feasible, a scandal broke out in Congress. Jay was accused of contravening his instructions and hiding key aspects of his negotiations with Spain from Congress. So this figure you know pretty well, and he's going to be key for Gardoqui, at least his last resources. He sought the support of Washington, who, despite having retired from politics and was living in Mount Vernon at the time, continued to enjoy enormous prestige and influence. To ingratiate himself with him, Gardoqui personally entrusted the delivery of a precious gift that King Carlos III had sent to General Washington, and it was a donkey, which was politely referred to as royal gift. He traveled with 2 female donkeys and another male donkey who died in the trip. And the caregiver, who was Thais, who obviously had no idea how to speak English either. So I would love to find out how Washington and the keeper actually exchanged their views on the donkeys. We will never know that. Gardoqui took advantage of the donkey's delivery to try to obtain Washington's support for the Spanish positions. But the astute Virginian would limit himself to thanking him for the gift, avoiding being involved in any political or diplomatic dispute. That's a guy. It was on the news, and if you go to Mount Vernon's museum, you're going to find him there. Just a few months later, Gardoqui insisted again in asking for Washington for help, this time sending him a vicuña cloth, His Majesty's true manufactured cloth that he had made specially for the general. It was of the wool of an animal that we all know, which is a cousin to the llamas, and it's supposed to be taken out from Buenos Aires, from the Viceroyalty of La Plata. A vicuña remnant actually remains in Mount Vernon. It was still trying to ID it. The general was especially grateful for the cloth, as expressed in, that's a piece of vicuña that they have in the museum. That would be the coat that Washington used. Obviously, that's not made from vicuña, it's silk, and that would be the piece of vicuña that's left. Usually, when the general died, and you all know that, they took the little pieces of the coats and gave it away to either their friends or their family. So that's what we have, and that was donated to the museum by one of the great grandsons or daughters. And that is a piece of the cloth that was used for the Continental Army. That's that Spanish blue wool that's also in the museum in Mount Vernon. So, despite the limited success in the previous efforts, by the end of 1787, perhaps hoping that the third time would be the charm, he again insisted with a new gift, an edition of Don Quixote. The origin dates back to a meeting or dinner at Benjamin Franklin's house in Philadelphia in which Washington heard about Cervantes' character for the first time. His curiosity was piqued. Thus, the next day, he bought an English edition translated by Tobias Smollett. Gardoqui was either present or learned of Washington's interest through his spies and did not miss the opportunity to give him what is still today considered one of the very best and most luxurious editions of the work, the one commissioned by the Royal Spanish Academy in 1780. This is also in the Museum of Mount Vernon, and that is our king visiting the Quixote that's still there. I don't have much time. So let's say that in 1788, the United States ratified its constitution, establishing a system of government. And at the same year, Charles III died, leaving the Spanish throne, unfortunately, to his son, Charles IV, who was a disaster. So as a diplomat, Gardoqui displayed a style unusual and traditional as an ambassador, which some authors would have described as direct, pragmatic, businesslike, that would produce mixed results. While Gardoqui's gift diplomacy would stumble against Washington's honesty, it would be much more successful when applied to less morally picky politicians who had no problem in accepting Cuban cigars, like Richard Henry Lee, or even an Arabian stallion, as the one presented to John Jay. Gardoqui's business contacts served him and his company very well, as we had seen, at a time when his main purpose should have been vested on negotiating the interests of his country. In addition to his diplomatic duties during his time as envoy to the Spanish crown to the United States, Gardoqui became involved in the task of attracting settlers to the then very still underpopulated Spanish province of Louisiana. Perhaps with the best intentions, he supported with too much proof several dubious initiatives that were presented to him to bring Catholic settlers from Maryland, Virginia, Kentucky, New York, or even Germany. In some cases, advancing money and funds to its organizers. These people never came, and the very few times when they actually came to settle, they had no experience as farmers. Diego Gardoqui returned to Bilbao on July 24th, 1789, aboard his own ship, the San Nicolas. In October 1791, he was appointed Secretary of the Treasury Office, or Minister of Finance in its current name, under the government of Prime Minister Manuel Godoy. In his 5 years as a minister, he had to face the expenses generated by the war against revolutionary France. From his position as a member of the government, Gardoqui would observe with a mixture of despair, rage, and frustration how the negotiations between Spain and the United States progressed, which would end in the signing on October 27, 1795, of the Spanish-American Treaty of Friendship, Limits and Navigation, known in Spain as the Treaty of San Lorenzo, and in the United States as Pinckney's Treaty. In this treaty, Spain acceded to each and every one of the United States' aspirations. The border was established at the 31st parallel, and on the pretense of mutual freedom of navigation, which served Spanish interests little or nothing, the Mississippi was completely open to American merchants. This was exactly what Gardoqui had endeavored to avoid during his 4 years as administrator to the United States. 3 months after signing the Treaty of San Lorenzo, Diego Gardoqui was appointed as ambassador to the Kingdom of Sardinia, which is capital in Turin. In fact, it was an honorable way for someone who had long fallen from grace. In his diaries, the Spanish politician and writer Jovellanos recorded this event when he wrote that Gardoqui received his belated justice and goes as ambassador to Turin, where he no longer will be able to prevaricate or to steal. So he was not very popular. In his 2 years in Turin, Gardoqui had the opportunity to see firsthand how the order of the old regime was beginning to collapse at the hands of the young General Bonaparte, who in northern Italy was leading revolutionary France from victory to victory. On the very day of his 63rd birthday, November 12, 1798, Diego Gardoqui died. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Professor Tomas Chávez, who will now present the role of diplomacy. Tomas Chávez has a PhD in history from the University of New Mexico. He has published 14 books, 3 of which have been published in translation in Spain. He has spent a career as a museum director and retired as the executive director of the National Hispanic Cultural Center. He's a member of the Orden de Isabel la Católica and a corresponding member of the Real Academia de la Historia. The Fundación Javier de Salas presented him with its inaugural award. His latest 2 books are The Diplomacy of Independence, Benjamin Franklin Documents in the Archives of Spain, and Revolutionary Diplomacy, Spanish Connections and the Birth of the United States. Please join me in welcoming Professor Chávez.
Oh, you could do more than that. Yeah. Thank you for giving up a Saturday to come and hear history. There's hope. And I want to thank the Daughters of the American Revolution for putting this on, as well as the Society, Queen Sofia Spanish Institute. This is important that this stuff like this happens. And it's happening. And so I'm proud to be part of it. And I guess my job is to keep you awake until the coffee break, right? So you can't see my thumb tricks up here, so I guess I'll have to give my talk. You've already heard over and over that when our founding fathers rebelled, there was no country. There were separate colonies, and they didn't know whether they were going to be a country. That took to 1789 when they finally resolved that they would be a country and accept each other. But in the meantime, They had made this daring feat. They rebelled against the strongest empire in the world. And oh my God, what are we going to do now? If we get caught, we're going to be hanged. They were creating treason. It was dangerous. We tend to forget that. Oh, the founding fathers, they were just having a good old time, having a rebellion. They were in danger. And they weren't going to succeed without the help of other countries. And they knew it. And so the first thing they had to do was to get together. And they did that through the Continental Congress. And my talk today is the role of diplomacy, but there's a subtitle to that, not the quote underneath. And the subtitle is, Up Until Spain Declares War on Great Britain. What did those crazy guys do to get those European countries to side with them, to fight with them? Now you think about this. This is a rebellion against a king, and they need kingdoms to help them rebel against a king. And none of them had any diplomatic experience. So it was a daunting task. So it all starts with the Continental Congress. Now I get to read. And they formed it to solicit that aid, as well as to deal with the rebellion. And so in November 1775, the Continental Congress formed, and I love this title, the Secret Committee of Correspondence. The Secret Committee of Correspondence. Whoa. And it's the committee in Congress that deserves credit for initiating the first official diplomatic contacts with Europe in general and France and Spain in particular. Congress sent Silas Deane to France. And there in France, he met the Minister of State, Vergennes, the Count of Vergennes, and he started negotiating. What he didn't know until he got there, though, was that France and Spain were already sending aid. They had formed that dummy company that we've heard about previously, Rodrigue Hartley-Say, that was supported and funded equally by France and Spain. They had already been set up, and they were sending aid already to the colonies. The other thing that the Continental Congress did was that General Lee, George Washington's second in command in charge of the Southern forces, sent George Gibson with 2 letters and a contingent of colonial soldiers to New Orleans, going down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. Gibson delivered both letters to the Spanish governor in New Orleans, and in those letters that are in the archives describe Gibson, or let me say this. First of all, the Spanish governor knew what Gibson was. He described him as a captain of the 1st Regiment of Virginia in the service of America. Okay? So now we have contact in New Orleans. The first letter that was delivered to that governor asked, would the King of Spain desire, quote, the acquisition of the town and harbor of Pensacola? And if it was acquired, would Spain receive possession of Pensacola? Lee's second letter detailed the colonial desire to circumstance the British naval blockade by receiving aid through New Orleans and up the Mississippi and Ohio rivers. While delivering the letters, Gibson himself personally asked the Spanish governor for supplies and gunpowder. Congress took a stronger, unquestioned position when it passed and signed the Declaration of Independence. Now there could be no doubt. It was a clarion call beyond its own borders that the rebellion was serious and that these men were putting their lives on the line. It was a public commitment that there was no turning back. The Committee for Secret Correspondence decided to expand its commission by sending Benjamin Franklin and John Deane. I guess I get to do this. There he is. You all know who that is, right? He wasn't sleeping in a park bench this morning. Yeah, okay. So they sent Franklin and John Deane to France to join with sent Franklin and Lee to join with Dean. Well, the Congress knew that covert aid was being provided by Spain and that France was an obvious target for help. They remained unsure of the extent of that help and knew that they needed more. The three men sent there had the task of again, going to kingdoms to get them to support them in a rebellion against the king. Congress correctly understood that France would be the most openly receptive country to its overtures. France had just lost the 7 Years' War to Great Britain, in the process of which it lost almost all of its major colonies. On the other hand, Spain, also a loser in the war, maintained most of its expansive American holdings, including the addition of Louisiana. Spain had a clear incentive to recoup Florida and remove the British settlements along the Mississippi River, as long as in Central America, where extensive British smuggling was causing financial problems for Spain's settlements in the region. Spain consciously collected any information as early as 1770, collected any information it could get on British movements and strategy. The reason was twofold. Marquis de Grimaldi, Spain's Minister of State at the time, suspected that Britain could conduct a surprise attack on Spanish-American ports. The second reason was the progress of the rebellion lessened the chances of that attack. As early as 1775, Spain came to realize that the revolt had evolved into a serious revolution. And they began to view the rebels, quote, as a serious force worthy of support. This is 1775, before the Declaration of Independence. This resulted in the covert aid being sent to the colonies from Spain and France. This was the context in which the United Colonies made their first official diplomatic foray to Europe. The three original commissioners arrived in Paris at different times, with Franklin being the last one when he made it to Paris on December 22nd, 1776. Franklin was the oldest and most experienced of the three men sent to France. Upon his arrival, he was less than a month shy of his 71st birthday, a little younger than all of us. Arthur Lee, the second who arrived just before Franklin, was 34 years younger than Franklin, was educated in medicine at the University of Edinburgh, and he also took classes at the University of Leiden in Netherlands before returning to London to become a lawyer and prolific defender of the colonies. While in London, he met, then replaced, and became jealous of Benjamin Franklin. Then there was Silas Deane, who was already in Europe. He's 36 years younger than Franklin. He was a graduate of Yale and practiced law for a short time before he became a merchant and represented Connecticut in the Continental Congress, serving with Franklin on the Committee for Secret Correspondence. Franklin was seen as the Commission's lead member. Realizing that Franklin's arrival, which was delayed, caused some consternation with Spain's ambassador, the Count of Aranda, who had advanced knowledge of Franklin's arrival. The commissioners quickly sent a letter to Aranda requesting a meeting, quote, to cultivate the goodwill of the courts of Spain and France. Aranda set the meeting for the evening of December 29th, 1776, at his residence. Thus began the official diplomatic connection between the Continental Congress and the government of Spain. Aranda's sympathetic attitude to the colonial cause was unknown to Franklin and his colleagues. The 58-year-old Spanish aristocrat, highly decorated and wounded combat veteran, maintained the idea that the rebellion in America gave Spain and France an opportunity to gain revenge upon Great Britain. He believed eventually the colonies would become a powerful nation with a population composed mainly of European immigrants. Spain, he thought, should have a vested interest in the future of that country and could not be indifferent to it. His superiors agreed with him to an extent. However, unlike their rush into the previous war, they would patiently prepare. This meant dealing with Great Britain on two fronts. First, Spain started sending, as we now know, covert aid to the rebelling colonies. Second, and equally important, if not more so, from its point of view, Spain initiated a military action to stop British expansion with Portuguese acquiescence in South America. Speculating that Great Britain would not risk a war or acknowledge its illegal operations there, Grimaldi sent to South America an armada of 7 ships of the line, 8 frigates, 4 smaller warships, and many transports carrying 14 infantry battalions and 4 cavalry squads. That force successfully attacked and destroyed Portuguese and British establishments down the coast, the east coast of South America, taking what is today Uruguay from the Portuguese and securing the Rio de la Plata and Buenos Aires. At the same time, another fleet sailed up the Tahoe River and anchored with its guns trained on Lisbon. Spain had made a stark and obvious point. Portugal, an ally of Great Britain, would remain neutral in any upcoming conflict. Specifically, Spain would not enter the actual fighting until the return of its fleet from South America, along with its West Indies fleet that had been recalled. The American commissioners in Paris were made aware of the fact. Nor could the diplomats overlook the lack of victories in the colonies. From a European point of view, the rebellion was serious and persistent, but far from victorious. Thus, during the first meeting with the Count of Aranda, the commissioners started off asking for friendship, which elicited from Aranda a direct, if not confrontational, reaction. He asked them, why would you come asking for friendship when in the situation, this is now a quote, when in the situation in which you find yourselves, anyone might judge that coming here was directed foremost at seeking and soliciting aid, not friendship. And that thus far, the colonies were not in peaceable possession of their freedom. Moreover, he added that if they did not represent a country, how could they expect an alliance? Franklin, somewhat taken aback, replied that he had papers from the Continental Congress and that had to be copied, and at a subsequent meeting he would provide them as a memorial. Aranda wondered why, openly, to Franklin, he had not copied the papers on his way to Europe when he had all kinds of time. Once again, Franklin was taken aback. Aranda also noted when he reported about the commissioners that none of them were fluent in French, including Franklin. And I need to do this. Franklin, first contacts with Europe, with Spain, was over the glass harmonica, what he's shown here, playing. He arranged for a glass harmonica to be sent to the third son of Carlos III, who in turn sent Franklin this book that Don Gabriel had translated from Latin. And that book is here in the Beinecke Library. And this is the letter that Franklin sent thanking the prince. That's the Conde de Aranda. He had that war wound, and so he was a man who was, as Spanish would say, was tuerto. He had a lazy eye, and he could not turn his head. He had to do this. But he was the kind of guy you would not go out with. He was no fun whatsoever, as Franklin was finding out. The Count of Vergennes, the French Minister of State. And this is a letter. If you look where the paragraph in the middle of the page, if you could read it, it says, Franklin habla muy poco francés, Dean mucho menos, y Lee nada. Nada Lee. All right? Just, I didn't make it up that they couldn't speak French. I just wanted to put that in there for you. You know, I'll make up something else, see if you catch me. So now we're waiting, you know, Aranda's waiting for that report. And, you know, probably stunned by Aranda's directness, the commissioners clearly understood that France and Spain were cooperating. 6 days later, after that first meeting, on January 4th, 1777, Aranda, Franklin, and Lee, along with a translator, met for a second meeting in Aranda's residence. Dean was sick in bed with an apparent bout of malaria. Franklin used Dean's malady as an excuse for not having the expected memorial. He and Lee told Aranda that the colonies sought a treaty with both Spain and France, each according to their own interest. Franklin mentioned the priority of receiving bronze cannons, warships, and if required, he would send a commissioner directly to Madrid. Aranda immediately replied that sending anyone to Madrid would not be desirable. Spain wanted to avoid all appearances of duplicity, which is why they were meeting after sunset in a mutual country. Moreover, Spain was working in coordination with France, so all such discussions would be better held in France. Aranda, somewhat perplexed that neither Franklin or Lee let on that they knew anything about aid being sent to the colonies. And incidentally, this is going to be the beginning, I think, the inception of why we don't understand this history to today. Aranda already is upset that the representatives aren't acknowledging any aid sent. They didn't mention the dummy company, nor acknowledge that at that moment Spain had acted on a request from the governor of Louisiana for a shipment that departed from the Spanish port of Bilbao, destined for New Orleans, to be transferred to the colonies. The shipment was augmented with supplies and gunpowder from Havana and Mexico, our neighbor today. That shipment eventually included 316 caliber rifles, 10,000 pounds of gunpowder, cloth that was dyed red, white, and blue, quinine, and more. Aranda again expressed his angst about the colonial situation and why weren't the commissioners asking for specific aid. He then pressed them and asked if they were aware of a ship that had arrived in Philadelphia in early May 1777 with a cargo of 216 bronze cannons, 12,825 bombs with fuses, 27 mortars, those little chubby fat cannons, with rifles and bayonets, uniforms, and 4,000 tents. Franklin acted as if he was unaware of aid being sent to Spain by Spain, only admitting that he knew of a company that was a front to the aid sent. Even in the colonies, the Continental Congress and George Washington assumed that the shipment was strictly French. They too did not understand that the Spanish money had helped purchase the French arms being delivered. This misapprehension has persisted for almost 2.5 centuries in the historiography of the United States. Aranda told the commissioners that more aid would be sent and confirmed Spain's willingness to leave its ports open to American shipping. 4 days later, Franklin and Lee personally delivered all the promised papers, including that promised memorial, which according to Aranda only proposed goodwill and reciprocal commerce. Aranda sent 2 long letters dated the same time on January 13th. The last third of the first letter was devoted to his reasoning for Spain to take the lead in going to war. He recommended that Spain consider a treaty, quote, to conserve its own possessions in America by assuring the loyalty of the new power and by freeing it of its urgent situation. Despite Aranda's opinions, the government in Spain maintained a policy of patience while covertly aiding the colonies. Madrid had more information than Aranda. Spain had 2 unofficial observers in the colonies, as well as an embassy in London. Both of the observers were known to the Continental Congress and had befriended some of our colonial leaders, not the least of which was George Washington. And in London, Spain's ambassador, the Prince of Mazarano, continued sending clear, matter-of-fact reports to Madrid. While appreciative of Aranda's motives, Grimaldi summed up his and his ministers' feelings. Spain would continue its policy. He wrote, "It is one thing to prepare for war and another to enter it when we are ready." Nor would Spain enter into a treaty with the colonies who he noted, once again, they were not a country. He added such a treaty would result in war. Spain would continue to send aid, and not to be overlooked, the commissioners seemed to be unaware that Virginia's own Oliver Pollock was working in New Orleans to receive more Spanish aid. At this time, Spain was in the process of changing its ministers of state. José Moñino y Rolando, the Count of Floridablanca, was named to replace Grimaldi. Move on with the slides here, I think. Oh, okay, we'll stop there. That was good. Floridablanca would continue Spain's strategy of patience while he waited for the return of the Spanish fleet from South America and New Spain. This is something that's going to be repeated while we're pressing for Spain to get into the war. Perhaps because of impatience or to divert attention, Franklin, Dean, and Lee decided to ignore Aranda's instructions not to send an emissary to Madrid. Even more surprising is that Aranda agreed with them. He provided them with a letter that in effect was a passport to go to Madrid. Then, probably Aranda sent word ahead that Arthur Lee was on his way to Madrid. Grimaldi, the Minister of State of France, sent word to his own ambassador in Madrid about Lee's pending trip, but he also called Lee's trip a breach of trust. Grimaldi, who was waiting for Floridablanca to replace him, also received notice in advance. He decided to send the bilingual merchant and banker whom you just heard about, Diego de Gardoqui, to intercept Lee. Grimaldi himself would also travel north to meet with Lee before he could get to Madrid. Gardoqui encountered Lee in Burgos in northeastern Spain. They agreed to meet in the smaller town of Vitoria-Gasteiz, where Grimaldi joined them. The two Spaniards directly told Lee of supplies being shipped and that Gardoqui's company, which was based in Bilbao, was shipping aid to the colonies. Moreover, Lee was directed to share with his colleagues that Gardoqui's company would continue to send supplies. Grimaldi also told Lee that Spain, through Aranda, would help get aid from Holland. Thus satisfied, Lee prepared to return to Paris, but not before he bypassed Franklin and Dean. He penned a report that he sent from Burgos directly to the Committee of Secret Correspondence. He wrote, quote, "I am authorized to assure you that supplies for the army will be sent by every opportunity from Bilbao. I am also desired to inform you of ammunition and clothing being deposited at New Orleans and Havana, with directions to lend them to such American vessels as may call there for that purpose. In fact, a shipment from New Orleans of over 9,000 pounds of powder stashed in 98 kegs arrived in Wheeling, Pennsylvania on May 2nd, 1777. Now the commission had two reasons to meet with Aranda. Lee wanted to report about his trip, especially about the news with Holland, and they just received instructions that they wanted to share. Aranda agreed to meet with them after nightfall again on Saturday, April 5th. Lee led off with analysis of his meeting with Grimaldi and Gardoqui. Lee made a veiled threat that if Spain and France did not help, the colonies might have to sue for an early peace and thereby leave the two countries exposed to war. Franklin patiently waited his turn, and after Lee finished, Franklin presented a sheaf of papers, which he explained were from Congress and spelled out what France and incidentally Spain could expect if they entered into an alliance with the colonies. Conversely, they also detailed some of what the colonies wanted. Franklin promised to have the papers translated and delivered to Aranda. In undertaking the writing of the instructions, Franklin made two mistakes. First, he wrote a similar but a different version and sent it to France before he sent it to Spain. And they differed a little bit. Both of them spoke of Congress's willingness to tie its goal of independence to the goals of Spain and France. In other words, we were prostituting ourselves to them. Franklin pointedly wrote in the French version that the Congress would not approach another government nor do anything to negotiate a peace without consulting France. This is a slight insult to Spain. Other details included the offer of warships and financial aid, American help with the conquest of Portugal, Canada, the Bahamas, and other British possessions. The conditions were almost laughable. The colonies were in no position to offer help in the war. They had no warships to share, had won no victories to date, and apparently were completely ignorant of Spain's current actions in regard to South America and Portugal. Surely Franklin did not expect Aranda to see the French version, which is actually what happened. Franklin appeared to favor the French more than the Spanish, and Aranda was too astute not to notice. At a subsequent meeting, Franklin presented Aranda with an oversized formal document. That would be it, with a red wax seal and signed by John Hancock, the president of the Continental Congress. The document named Franklin the congressional minister to Spain. Franklin also presented Aranda with an accompanying letter. Signed by him. And in that company letter he had written in his hand, as you can see up there, he explained that he had been named Minister Plenipotentiary, the exact language you need to be named an ambassador. After some back and forth, Aranda agreed to receive the original document and not a copy. Aranda also explained he should have been clear to Franklin. For the same reasons that had caused the interception of Lee, Aranda told Franklin that he could do no less than persuade him not to carry out his commission. He then justified that position again. He pointed out that one of those reasons was that Spain would not act until word of its South American fleet's return, the success of which needed to be realized. Franklin replied in writing that the Congress would respect Spain's desire. 2 months between the months between those first meetings in late 1777 would be a difficult period for the American commissioners. They could not help but be disheartened by the lack of good news from home. Neither France or Spain were ready for war, and France understood that Spain would not commit until its fleets arrived. Verjan and Spain's new Minister of State, Floridablanca, decided that it would be best to keep their distance from the Americans. Aranda received instructions from Madrid to limit his contact with the Americans to writing. In June of that same year, Aranda intercepted a letter that Franklin intended for Verjan, and he shared it with Verjan. It contained nothing new except for the comment that the only way Spain and France could avoid a separate and early peace was to enter into an alliance with the colonies first. Once again, Aranda saw this as an affront. Franklin penned a second letter, which he sent directly to Spain, and he implored them to enter the war, writing, quote, and I love this quote, "Heaven has rarely offered such a favorable opportunity." And then he added, "Nations are always skillful at imagining pretexts for the wars they want to engage in." In other words, we can make it up to go to war. That's Franklin's advice to Aranda, who sent the letter to Floridablanca. And Floridablanca quickly wrote a livid reply that he sent to Aranda. He was irritated by the Americans' lack of gratitude and instructed Aranda to make his position clear to the Americans. Spain, he wrote, had been sending aid to the rebels for the past 2 or 3 years, and in that a good portion of the money was used to purchase the supplies in France, then shipped from Bilbao and now from Holland. There could be no clear evidence of our support, he said, that neither Congress nor its deputies could mistake. Moreover, he added, France seemed equally silent on the matter. Upon hearing this from Aranda, Franklin quickly made a personal after-sunset visit to the ambassador's residence. He thanked Aranda for Spain's aid not only in money but in supplies and equipment. He acknowledged the shipments from Bilbao and other ports, and that he personally knew of a shipment that arrived in Boston with 12,000 muskets. And in the case of France, Aranda directly threatened Spain that Spain would cease its cooperation with that country and deal with the colonies on its own. Aranda was convinced that France would draw Spain into the war when it didn't want to enter. He insisted that Spain strike the first blow, and even noted that the combined navies of Spain and France would defeat the British. Still, Floridablanca maintained Spain's policy of wait and see. Floridablanca felt that he could broker a peace and avoid war. By July, Vergennes felt that France was ready to enter the war, but Louis XVI, his king, also Louis the Last, would do nothing without assurances from Spain. The news arrived that a British army under the command of General John Burgoyne had taken Saratoga and that Philadelphia was under threat. That was not good news. In September 1777, Franklin convinced Dee and Lee to join him in another memorial that they sent to Vergennes and Aranda. It was a serious, if not desperate, attempt at rekindling the support they thought had been reduced. The somewhat rambling memorial requested more aid, including 80,000 suits of clothes, brass cannons, muskets, pistols, large quantities of naval stores, plus a loan of 2 million sterling to be paid back at 6% interest on the credit of the Congress, which didn't exist, the credit. In return, the colonies were stockpiling, quote, great quantities of tobacco, rice, indigo, potash, and other products of the country. Obviously, Aranda was underwhelmed. The report bemoaned the problem, quote, relating to our armed vessels and their prizes, talking about piracy, and understood that the lack of decent support was a legitimate concern due to the certain circumstances and the occupation of other great affairs. However, if peace, this is the interesting one, if peace must be brokered, the commissioners made the surprising proposal. Would Spain and France agree to help the colonies with their advice and influence in the negotiations? Floridablanca answered with a long memorial that was sent to Vergennes. Spain was not impressed with the American threats of an early peace. Moreover, Spain continued to send aid and the request for the 2 million pounds sterling appeared reasonable. He added that the revolution continued to weaken Great Britain and Spanish aid played no small part. The Americans needed to realize that the combined strength of France and Spain, when ready, would be to their advantage. Spain's interest was to work secretly and cautiously, and King Carlos III would not enter into an agreement that is, quote, time to quit, not based. Oh, okay. I'm done.
Not that way.
Apologies. I would like to make the announcement that Her Majesty Queen Sofia will be attending Professor Richard Kagan's keynote address. So I ask you that you kindly be back at 12 noon sharply, and we'll take a coffee break now. Thank you.